It was one of those weekday evenings where nobody really wanted to go home yet, but nobody had energy for anything ambitious either. I remember standing outside this casual place near the office. The kind with string lights that try a little too hard. Phone in my hand, jacket still on. Someone had texted, "We're grabbing a quick bite if you want to join." Not an invitation with pressure, just information. And somehow that made it heavier. I wasn't hungry. I'd already eaten something small at my desk, but the idea of saying no felt like it would require an explanation I didn't have the energy to give. So I went. I ordered something forgettable, paid more than I would have at home, and laughed at the right moments. On the walk back to my car later, I realized I couldn't remember what I ate. I only remembered tapping my card. That stuck with me. Not because the money hurt, but because it didn't register at all. It felt like the cost of staying in rhythm. Like the price of not breaking the flow of the night. I used to tell myself it was just easier this way. Easier to order, easier to join, easier to not be the guy complicating things. And for a long time, that logic felt airtight. Convenience felt practical, even responsible. You're busy, everyone's busy. Why create friction where there doesn't need to be any? But after a while, I started noticing how often money was doing the talking for me. Instead of saying I was tired, I paid for delivery. Instead of saying I didn't really want to go out, I paid for another round. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about smoothing edges. I didn't notice it at first because none of it felt like a choice. It felt like maintenance, like the cost of being agreeable, flexible, low effort. And that's the part I didn't want to look at first. That these weren't comfort expenses. They were social ones. Little payments made quietly so nothing would slow down, including me. Once I started noticing it, I couldn't unsee how many plans just sort of happened around me. Coffee runs where everyone stood up at once. Rideshares ordered without discussion. Tickets bought because someone else already clicked purchase. Nobody ever asked directly if I was in. It was more like the room assumed yes unless someone slowed it down, and I almost never slowed it down. It felt cheaper to pay than to interrupt the momentum. So I paid, again and again. The strange thing is I didn't feel taken advantage of. I felt complicit. Like I was choosing convenience over clarity. Over a month, those little yeses blended together. Over a year, they quietly became a line item I never wrote down. I told myself this was just how adult social life worked. That this was normal, and maybe it is. But there was something uncomfortable about realizing how much of my spending wasn't about wanting anything at all. Subscriptions were another place this showed up, even though they didn't feel social at first. Streaming platforms, premium tiers, shared tools everyone assumed you had. Nobody pressured me to keep them, but canceling felt oddly isolating, like opting out of a shared language. Someone would mention a show or a feature and I'd think, yeah, I guess I need that too. Not because I cared, but because not having it felt like friction. So I kept paying. 10 here, 15 there. I barely used most of them. Some months I forgot they existed, but I noticed how uncomfortable it felt to imagine explaining why I didn't have them anymore. That was the real cost. Not the money, but the subtle feeling of being out of sync. It was strange realizing I wasn't paying for access. I was paying to stay aligned with everyone else's defaults. Upgrades used to feel like rewards. Then they just became habits. Faster shipping, better seats, slightly nicer versions of things I didn't really think about. Most of the time I upgraded because it removed a pause, because it kept things moving, especially when other people were involved. Nobody wants to be the one asking if the cheaper option is okay. So I clicked to the nicer one. I told myself it wasn't that much more, and it wasn't, not once. But over time, I noticed how little joy those upgrades brought me. I didn't feel happier. I just felt less noticeable. And that's a weird realization, that some expenses don't buy pleasure. They buy invisibility. They buy the ability to blend in and not disrupt the moment. I don't remember enjoying those upgrades. I just remember paying for them. There was a stretch where I genuinely thought convenience meant I was doing adulthood right. Ordering out instead of cooking, paying to save time, always being reachable, always flexible. It looked responsible from the outside. And I defended it pretty hard. I'd tell myself I was busy, tired, stretched thin. Sometimes that was true, sometimes it wasn't. What I didn't notice was how rarely I questioned whether convenience was actually helping me. It felt like progress, even when it didn't change anything. I wasn't calmer. I wasn't more rested. I was just spending more to maintain the same level of tired. That's the part that stuck with me later. How often I used convenience as proof that I was coping without checking if I actually was. Food was where this showed up the clearest. Group lunches, shared dinners, late night orders. Splitting checks made everything feel smaller than it was. 20 here, 30 there. It never felt like a decision, just participation. I noticed how meals stopped being about eating and started being about logistics. What's easiest? What keeps everyone happy? What avoids a back and forth? I can remember plenty of receipts. I can't remember many meals. And that's uncomfortable in a quiet way, because food is supposed to be memorable, or at least present. But so many of those meals blurred together. I wasn't eating badly, I just wasn't eating intentionally. Money was moving, but nothing was really landing. There were a lot of moments where I paid simply to avoid explaining myself. Ride shares instead of public transit. Quick fixes instead of slower options. I didn't think of it that way at the time. It felt like efficiency. But looking back, it was more about dodging small discomforts. The kind that aren't dramatic, just mildly awkward. Money became a shortcut through those moments. Tap and move on. No questions. No pauses. I didn't notice how often I reached for my card instead of my words. And that realization was uncomfortable, because it meant I wasn't always choosing ease. Sometimes I was choosing silence. Group momentum is a powerful thing. Once plans are moving, changing them feels like work. And I rarely wanted to be the source of work. So I went along. I paid. Even when I hadn't fully decided if I wanted to be there, especially then. I noticed how often my spending was dictated by timing rather than intention. If I had more time to think, I might have chosen differently. But speed erased that space. Decisions happened fast. Payments happened faster, and afterward, I'd tell myself it was fine, that it wasn't worth overthinking, but those moments stacked up, not loudly, just steadily. At some point, I did a rough calculation that made me pause. There was this one convenience habit I barely noticed, about $18 a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. It felt harmless, but $18 a week turns into around $75 a month. That's about $900 a year. Over 5 years, that's $4,500. I remember staring at that number longer than I expected. Not because it ruined me, but because I never would have agreed to spend $4,500 on that thing if someone had asked up front. I only agreed to 18 over and over again. That's what made it uncomfortable. How easy it is to say yes to the small version without realizing what you're actually committing to. The strange thing is, none of this felt indulgent. I've always been pretty aware of big purchases. I'd research them, stress about them, debate them. But these convenience expenses didn't trigger any alarms. They felt practical, necessary even. That's what let them slide through. I judge myself harder for obvious splurges than for these quiet leaks. And looking back, that feels backwards. The small stuff had more impact. Not individually, collectively. I didn't feel reckless. I felt responsible. And that might have been the most misleading part. I used to frame a lot of this as temporary. Just this month. Just while things are busy. Just until life settles down a bit. But life doesn't really do that. It doesn't settle. It just changes shape. And temporary habits have a way of sticking around longer than planned. I kept waiting for a calmer version of myself to show up and reassess everything. Meanwhile, the charges kept coming. It's strange how patience with the future can justify almost anything in the present, especially when convenience is involved. Over time, I noticed my sense of value shifting. Prices that would have made me pause a few years earlier barely registered anymore. Small increases slid by unnoticed. I didn't renegotiate. I didn't reconsider. I just absorbed them. Convenience had dulled my sensitivity, and that's uncomfortable to admit, because it means normalization did more work on my spending than desire ever did. I wasn't chasing more. I was just accepting higher baselines without question. It didn't help that everywhere I looked, this behavior was reinforced. Friends, coworkers, social media, everyone moving fast, ordering freely, upgrading without comment. It set a tone, not aggressively, just quietly. And it's hard to question a tone when it feels universal. I didn't feel jealous. I felt pressure. The low-grade kind that doesn't announce itself. It just hums in the background, nudging you along. There were moments I noticed the pattern and still looked away. Times I felt the drain and told myself it wasn't the right moment to think about it, that I'd deal with it later. Those were probably the hardest moments to remember, because awareness was there. I just didn't want to complicate things. Not socially, not emotionally, and definitely not financially. Convenience makes avoidance feel reasonable, even when you know better. One thing that surprised me was how little I remembered from all this spending. So many transactions. So few moments. Money left, but nothing stayed. No stories. No highlights. Just receipts. That's a strange imbalance. To pay so much and retain so little? It made me wonder what I thought I was buying in the first place. Saying yes became automatic. I stopped feeling the pause where choice used to live. And decisions happened without my full attention. And that's unsettling in hindsight, because attention is where agency hides. When things move too fast, you don't lose control dramatically. You just stop noticing when it slips away. At some point, it clicked that convenience really had become a kind of social currency. It bought ease. It bought flow. It bought the ability to stay unremarkable. Nobody talks about that part. But it's real. And it's expensive. Not just in dollars, but in awareness, in memory, and choice. The relief convenience offered never lasted as long as the charges did. That's what stood out most. Ease fades quickly, bills don't. And there's something quietly lopsided about that. Paying for moments that disappear almost immediately, while the cost sticks around for months. Now, when another invitation pops up, another quick plan, another easy yes, I notice the moment more. I don't always choose differently, but I see it. The familiarity of it, the smoothness, the way convenience slips in without asking. It didn't suddenly become social currency. It happened slowly, one small decision at a time, one easy tap, one night where it felt simpler to go along than to stop and think.